On behalf of the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health, I welcome each of you to today's webinar, Indigenous Peoples, Food Safety and Security and Climate Change in Canada. My name is Roberta Stout, and I'm a research associate with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health. Our center is located at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, BC, the traditional territory of the Ts'eedı First Nation. I am, however, zooming in from Winnipeg in beautiful Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis people. I will be facilitating today's webinar. Next slide. Very briefly, the NCCIH is one of 6 national collaborating centers for public health that was established in 2005 with funding from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Our sister NCCs are focused on specific topic areas, including infectious diseases, environmental health, healthy public policy, determinants of health, and methods and tools for knowledge translation. Our center supports health equity for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples by promoting the use of Indigenous-informed evidence to transform practice, policy, and program decision-making across all sectors of public health. Next slide. All questions for panelists, as well as any technical questions you may have, can be submitted in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. Links to resources mentioned throughout the presentations will be posted in the chat window. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on the NCCIH website. Also, you should know that there may be some brief pauses as we switch between presenters and screen sharing functions. Next slide. The learning objectives of today's webinar are to understand how climate change is threatening traditional food sources within Indigenous populations in northern regions of Canada, to explore the challenges and creative opportunities for food security adaptations to climate change underway within Indigenous contexts, and to share how community-driven food security adaptations to climate change can have the added benefit of promoting Indigenous knowledge between generations, enhancing community support networks, strengthening cultural resilience, and fostering collective health and well-being. Next slide, please. We are very pleased to have the following 2 speakers with us today, Meaghan Wilton and Paul Cressman. I'll introduce Dr. Meaghan Wilton first and then have her present her presentation. So Dr. Meaghan Wilton is an agroecosystem and food security researcher in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at the University of Toronto. Meaghan grew up on a mixed co-op livestock farm in Southern Ontario, situated in the Saugeen-Anishinaabegin, Saugeen-Ojibwe territory. She continued her passion for agriculture and environmental studies through post-secondary education and gaining international research experience in temperate, subtropical, and subarctic regions. Since 2013, she has collaborated with First Nations communities to create northern gardening projects that are community-centered and focus on climate change adaptation. Welcome, Meaghan.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen first. All right. And you can see it okay? So good day, everybody. And first of all, thank you, Roberta, for the introduction. And I would also thank Roberta and the NCCIH for inviting me to be a part of this presentation and share my experience on subarctic gardening, as this has become quite a passion of mine. Currently, I'm calling in from and living in the city of Waterloo, Ontario, which is situated on the Haldimand tract of the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, I truly appreciate being able to live here. Today, I will share some strategies that we have used to enhance food production in the Subarctic First Nation of Fort Albany. I started working in Fort Albany in 2013 as a research assistant, as I had a background in agriculture and climate change mitigation. And my first trip to Fort Albany was a very enlightening experience, and I absolutely fell in love with the community. And I wanted to continue and extend this research project into a long-term project or a program. To give some context of Fort Albany First Nation, or also called Pidabek, it's in the Mushkegowuk Cree territory. It is on the western coast of James Bay and along the Albany River. It is an isolated community, so traveling in and out is usually by plane. However, people use the rivers to travel by shallow boat crafts, and they have a seasonal, they use a seasonal ice road that runs between roughly around January to March. And this ice road is a lifeline for communities within the region, as it provides food, non-perishable foods, as well as fuel, machinery, and infrastructure supplies. During the other months of the year, most supplies have to be shipped in by plane, and this can be fairly costly. And this is also relates to some of the high costs of food, and fresh food having to go that long transport, it makes it more vulnerable to spoilage. And this is an issue for many of the 1,200 residents of Fort Albany, as many rely on the imported foods. And recently there was a food security survey done, like per household, in the community, and it was found that 70.3% of people living in the community was considered food insecure. So our research team has been partnering with Fort Albany First Nation for over 30 years, working on projects related to environment and health, and this includes food security. And one of the strategies for food security was to creating subarctic gardens. This is a map of generally where Fort Albany First Nation is located, and it's on the plant hardiness zone map. And plant hardiness zone map kind of provides some insight of what plants can grow where. And Fort Albany First Nation is located in the Zone 1B, and there's not very much information available on gardening for Zone 1B. And so, however, the temperatures have been increasing, influenced by climate change. As well, we use technologies, agricultural technologies, to allow us to grow crops that would be suitable for the 2-zone plant hardiness. And as climate is projected to further increase, this also increases the amount of frost-free days, which increases the range of crops that can be grown in the region. This slide is the progression of the Fort Albany Community Garden. Initially in 2012 to 2014, it was production trials looking at specifically beans and potatoes. And we had this garden site located along the willow trees or thickets, and they were acting as a windbreak. And we compared the production of beans and potatoes in this windbreak space versus an open field. And we found that the yield and biomass of bean and potatoes increased significantly in this space with the windbreaks. After 2014, I became the the project coordinator. And from 2015 to 2017, we were diversifying more crops. We incorporated perennials and looked at some low-tech strategies. As well, at this point, the project was transitioning from a research project to a community program operated through Quebec Health Services. And in 2018 to present, we continue to fine-tune how we do our strategies in the community garden, as well as diversifying crops and making the space more welcoming to community members. One of the main goals with the Northern Gardening is to utilize techniques that are regionally suitable. And this includes consideration of culture, the socio-economic context, and the environmental conditions. And in order to have technologies that are suitable for the region, it's very important that they harmonize with Indigenous knowledge and the land-based activities that are occurring in the region. So today I will go through the strategies by theme of building up garden capacity, enhancing garden environment, and supporting community outreach. So the first thing with building up garden capacity is finding a site and doing an assessment. And so we worked with the Fort Albany Band to find a suitable location. And this included looking at the community and site history along with other perimeters. And one of the key features for this site, other than the windbreaks, is that there was a road, so it's easily accessed to community members. And there is a lake nearby that we could use as a water source. Another very important aspect to assessing sites for gardening is doing a soil contaminant analysis to ensure that the soil is safe for agricultural use. Next is collecting supplies. The far north of Canada has very limited agricultural infrastructure. And so supplies have to be brought up, and that can be a challenge or relate to costs. So first, we look at what materials are available locally and utilize that in the garden and see where it can be used in the garden. And then we bring in supplies. We've been adding supplies over time per growing season. We plan early, we get the supplies on the ice road to reduce economical costs, and we have the supplies available by May and June, so the supplies will be available by May and June. And another consideration when bringing in supplies is where they're going to be stored. And we found and recommend using shipping containers or sea cans, as they work pretty great. Next is creating the garden. And for communities that are interested in creating a northern garden, I recommend to start small and expand accordingly. We did not do this as it was a research trial, and we found that it was a lot of maintenance and labor required. And so we started to move into constructing low maintenance garden beds. And I have a couple resources available on the different garden beds we've used in Fort Albany, and one PDF file that gives a general instructions or guides on how to make these box garden beds. As well, when creating a garden, it's important to identify a community-based coordinator or coordinators. They don't necessarily need to have agriculture or garden experience, but more importantly, have interest in the subject, enjoy working outdoors, are good problem solvers, and a little bit of a risk taker, as gardening is trial and error. As well, to consider when making a garden is to have a training and management plan, whether it's volunteer or employment based. For Fort Albany First Nation, we do training and management through employment, and it's usually around 2 to 6 people working in the garden within a garden season. Moving on to the next theme is enhancing garden environment. We had, at the beginning, we really had a focus on enhancing the climate for crop growth. And so I spoke a little bit about windbreaks, and they do help slightly warm up the space. as well as they reduce the amount of cool and high winds coming into the space, which can be fairly damaging to crops, these high winds. Also, we've added low tunnels, which are like mini seasonal greenhouses, and we like to use those for growing carrots. As well, we have horticultural black tarp. This helps increase the soil temperatures early in the season to help with plant establishment. As well, the black horticultural tarp helps reduce the amount of weeding required. As well, we have raised beds at varying heights, and they also increase the temperature during the main growing season. It improves drainage for crops that don't really like wet feet. And the height of the beds make weeding and maintenance easier as there's less strain and bending down. And we started to use high tunnels, either bought or made, and this helps extend the growing season. As well, with enhancing the garden environment is expanding the diversity of the crops. So we started with just beans and potatoes, and now we have about 27 different crops growing in the garden. I have a resource available of the list of crops that we've grown at the site. We look for crops that have tolerance to cold weather, that mature fairly quickly. A lot of it's trial and error. We also grow crops that are requested by community members or crops that complement traditional foods such as moose stew. And we look at crops that currently existed and or were historically cultivated. As well, we look at new crops and climate adaptable crops. So for instance, bok choy has grown really well in Fort Albany. We've had a few times successes with zucchinis, and we've been growing some flowers. We had this dwarf sunflower. Usually they never bloomed in time. In this past season, it bloomed in August, and it was pretty amazing to see. Another part of enhancing the garden environment is managing soil fertility. We still have challenges with managing soil fertility, as northern soils tend to have low available nutrients. For Fort Albany, for instance, it has sufficient nitrogen. However, there's low availability of phosphorus and potassium. So to improve the soil conditions for plant growth, we have created local compost, and we use an Actium pot composter, that's a batch composter. And I have a resource available for this as well. And we put the organic matter in this drum of this composter and either import it, both imported and local. So for instance, we use food spoilage from fruit and vegetable spoilage from the grocery store, leaves, shredded paper, wood shavings from the local sawmill. And we've also used the non-edible portions of Canadian geese. And so this composter was originally manufactured for poultry producers. And so we've utilized it along with our Share the Harvest Geese program. So the non-edible portions, such as the head, the feet, and feathers, went into the composter, and we tested the compost. It was good to be used. And then we also collected the bones and we ground them to make local bone meal to help with phosphorus in the soil. Moving on to the next theme is support community outreach. We have community and training in the community garden. As well, we hold events. One of the most popular events is a harvest event that occurs in October, where community members can come and harvest what they like. We also host school and youth group field trips. And for crops that are ready earlier in the season, such as beans and kale, we harvest them and we distribute it throughout the community. As well, we have a tool share program for those interested in home and bush gardens, and we also do workshops for the at-home and bush garden, the people that are interested in it. And the people who are interested in the home and bush garden are a key component to this program as they bring in innovations and help build strategies that work best for the region. And some of my favorite innovations has been a prospector tent that was modified to become a seasonal greenhouse. And I like the extra touch where they opened up the top to allow rainfall to come in. As well, for a bush garden, an irrigation system for a bush garden was a perforated hose that was attached to a ram pump that's in a creek. And also a backyard composter that was repurposed from, or made from an old dryer drum. And so the lessons we have learned and the experiences we have in Fort Albany has given us the opportunity to extend our garden program to Mayapukek First Nation in Newfoundland. And they broke ground in October 19th, and they've had 2 growing seasons so far. Thank you for listening. And at this time, I'd like to acknowledge our funders, CIHR, and the Climate Change and Health Adaptation Program, as well as the academic institution that our research team is affiliated with. And a special thanks goes to Peterbeck Health Services and the community of Fort Albany First Nation, and Con River Health and Social Services and the community of Mayapukek First Nation. Megwach.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Meaghan. And I would like to make sure that if any of the people who are on the webinar have questions that they'd like Meaghan to address following Paul's presentation in our Q&A session, to please be sure to use the Q&A button so that we make sure that we get those questions to Meaghan in the Q&A session. So I'd like to also now warmly welcome our next speaker, Paul Cressman, Program Development Officer for the Clecho government in the Northwest Territories, who has worked to support communities to develop a wide variety of engagement and capacity building programs. Paul's work focuses primarily on cultural learning programs, but has also ventured into the world of environmental monitoring, culturally appropriate outdoor safety certification, and economic development. Paul graduated with an honors Bachelor of Outdoor Recreation, Parks and Tourism from Lakehead University in 2003. He moved to the Northwest Territories in 2007 with a 6-month plan to stay, and moved to Ottawa 11 years later, where he now lives with his wife and 2 children. Paul has worked full-time for the Clecho government since 2015. He feels honored and humbled to be able to work for and with the Clecho people. Schedules, budgets, logistics, risk management plans, funding applications, and report writing. Paul spends a lot of time doing the boring work that helps other people get out on the land, pass on cultural skills and knowledge, and have fun. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much. I feel very lucky to be able to present to you today. As was mentioned, I'm here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, but I work for the Clecho government in the Northwest Territories, in Treaty 11 territory. I've had the honor to work for and with the Clecho government for the last about 12 years. But I just like to acknowledge that I myself am not Clecho, and I'm not speaking with a Clecho voice. So when I use the word we, I'm referring to the Clecho government and the Department of Culture and Lands Protection, who I work for, but not the Clecho Nation as a whole or Clecho people specifically. In this presentation, I'm going to speak about Clecho Dunta ts'eedı, a program that the Clecho government is running in all 4 Clecho communities. For context, I'll briefly talk about the Clecho region, government, and culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the effect that climate change is having in the Clecho region for both ecosystems and culture. I'm going to talk about one program that we have developed to help people adapt to some of the adverse effects of climate change. I'll introduce some key outcomes to the program and opportunities worth exploring into the future. And then obviously I'm happy to take any questions this time. In 2005, the Tlicho Nation ratified the Tlicho Agreement with the federal government of Canada. This agreement recognized the formation of the Tlicho government and gave ownership of 39,000 square kilometers of land, including surface and subsurface rights, to the Tlicho people. The Tlicho land is located between Great Slave Lake in the south and Great Bear Lake in the north. It's comprised of 4 distinct communities: Wati, Wekwati, Gamati, and Beshiko. Beshiko and Wati are accessible by all-season road, but Gamati and Wekwati are accessible by air or canoe in the summertime, and a short ice road season, in the winter. As is the case all across the north, climate change is being felt in the Tlicho region. Elders are reporting a change in weather patterns, and that new species, which never used to come as far north, are now entering the region. Most acutely, however, climate change is linked to the decline of equo, or barren land caribou, populations. Ongoing calving ground study results for populations of the Bathurst and Blue-nosed East herds show, quote, a continuing rapid decline in both herds, end quote. The significance of equo to the Tlicho cannot be overstated. As former Tlicho Grand Chief George Mackenzie recently said, quote, the equo are a keystone species. They have shaped the cultural identity of the Tlicho. Our history, our language, culture, and way of life are joined with equo. We depend on them for food, clothing, and equipment. They have been with us as far back as we can remember, end quote. An important message to take away from Grand Chief's statement is that for the Tlicho, equo are not only a source of food, but also a source of cultural connection and collective cultural memory. For young Tlicho people, climate change and caribou decline means not only an absence of a healthy source of protein in their diets, but also an absence of opportunities to practice what it means to be Tlicho. The ceremonies around hunting and coming of age, the social connection, intergenerational relationships, and community building that comes with collectively scraping and tanning hides, the knowledge about the wide array of clothing and tools that come from the equo, the drums that are dependent on hides harvested at certain times of year, and the drumming, songs, and cultural significance that is tied up in the drum. All that is also at risk because of climate change. When we as a government and a department think about adapting to climate change, we are not only thinking about how to replace a vital food source, but we are also thinking about how to create opportunities for young Tlicho people to connect to their culture in the absence of equo. With this in mind, the program that we developed addresses the idea of climate change adaptation from lenses of both food security and cultural restoration. Dunta ts'eedı in English means to share food among the people. Throughout history, providing food and sharing food with those in need was the key to survival for the Tlicho people. Younger people were taught the necessary skills by older, more experienced harvesters. Those who were fit and strong would harvest food and share it with elders, and those who were unable to harvest food for themselves. In this way, knowledge was passed on and everybody ate. One of the legacies of residential schooling is that many of the social relationships that contributed to social cohesion and knowledge transfer were broken in the Tlicho communities. And while that's a topic for another presentation, it's important to note that the fracturing of the continuity of knowledge transfer has made it even more difficult for the Tlicho to address food security, because the young and fit no longer learn the skills to harvest food and, in many cases, lack the language skills to go talk to the people who can teach them. Tlicho Dunta ts'eedı is quite a simple program on paper. The program pairs young adults with experienced harvesters. As a team, they go out fishing, hunting, trapping, snaring, and berry picking. Harvesting any food other than equo is supported through this program. Food that is harvested is brought to the community and distributed by the youth to elders. By participating in this program, young people spend time on the land being physically active, learning traditional skills, providing a service to their communities, and interacting with elders. Harvesters have an opportunity to pass on their knowledge. They get an extra set of hands to help with their work, and they receive funds to help pay for gas and equipment. Elders get access to a traditional diet and are socially engaged when youth come to visit. If you give a man a fish, the saying goes, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, it continues, you feed him for a lifetime. Now, if, however, in that saying, the you is a Tlicho youth and the man is a Tlicho elder, now the saying starts, if a Tlicho youth gives a Tlicho elder a fish, well, in the Tlicho communities, when youth bring fish to elders, the chances are good that the young person will be invited in for tea, in which case they will definitely sit down and listen to stories, hear their language, learn about significant place names, and start to learn about the ancient knowledge that builds real cultural resilience, pride, identity, and respect. By teaching their young people to fish, the Tlicho are starting to rebuild age-old cultural knowledge systems that have been systematically eroded by colonialism for more than 2 centuries. In practical terms, this program feeds elders, but more than that, it nourishes youth physically, emotionally, and spiritually, and teaches them skills that they can use for a lifetime. Through this simple process, the Tlicho are adapting to climate change by rebuilding systems of knowledge transfer. Tlicho Dunta ts'eedı is using old knowledge to address a relatively new problem. This program supports youth to go on the land and harvest food. While on the land, the youth are making empirical observations about the natural environment they encounter. Working alongside experienced harvesters means that what they are seeing can be contextualized with the harvesters' own experiences over the past few decades. Creating opportunities for youth to talk with elders means that their experiences and observations can be compared to an elder's lifetime of observation, as well as stories that speak to environmental observation and monitoring over centuries. The opportunities to gather anecdotal measures of change through this program are significant. At this point, Tlicho Dunta ts'eedı is working towards knowledge gathering. However, in the future, the information collected can be used in partnership with other governments to help inform environmental planning and policy development. The barrenland caribou populations that have sustained the Tlicho for millennia are declining, and there's a very real possibility that the herds may never return to the numbers where sustainable harvesting is ecologically possible. Adapting to climate change and this new reality from a food security perspective means using ancient knowledge to revitalize the use of fisheries and small game harvesting activities that have proven to be effective and sustainable over many centuries. At this point in time, at least, these fisheries and small game populations are not showing signs of rapid change compared with equul. We have seen that by supporting harvesters to do what they do best, this program can provide significant amounts of healthy food to the communities while actively monitoring the health of the land, fish, and wildlife populations. At the outset of Tlicho Dunta ts'eedı, we asked youth, harvesters, and elders what success would look like in this program. We did not hear that success would be measured in pounds of food harvested and distributed. Instead, we heard that success would be measured in the relationships that were made, the knowledge that was transferred, and the social engagement of multiple generations through this program. Furthermore, from both scientific study and general observation, we know that more time on the land, more exposure to cultural activities, and more youth elder engagement equals improved health outcomes, cultural resilience, and skill development that will enable communities to better adapt to climate change moving forward. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, Tlicho Dunta ts'eedı is currently running in all 4 communities. We've needed to modify things a bit, and we now have family groups harvesting together and distributing food with public health measures in place. But still, many people are actively harvesting food for their communities in the Tlicho region as I speak. Through this program over the last few years, we have harvested and distributed roughly 5,000 kilograms or 11,000 pounds of fish and meat to community elders, and those numbers are growing literally every day right now. Yes, this program can help communities adapt to climate change. Yes, it can provide data that can inform environmental policy. Yes, it can help start addressing food security issues. And this is in part what reconciliation looks like. This is empowering Indigenous communities to rebuild knowledge transfer systems and therefore cultural resilience. This is honoring the deep ecological knowledge of both male and female elders. This is supporting communities to find and implement solutions that make sense for them. We've been fortunate enough to receive funding for this program through both federal and territorial governments. Supporting programs like this are examples of reconciliation in action. It is the right thing to do and an effective way to do it. Undeniably, climate change is threatening food security, culture, and way of life for the ts'eedı. What the ts'eedı have to combat this, their secret weapon, if you will, is the intimate knowledge of the land, animals, and plants that have sustained them and been passed down for millennia. Through ts'eedı, we are helping communities adapt to climate change by rebuilding cultural knowledge transfer, working with the land, using traditional skills, and strengthening communities by teaching and empowering youth. Masicho, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that presentation. And again, we invite any questions that people have on that presentation to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So I also would like to invite Meaghan to join us at this point. And I'm going to actually start with some questions that have come in that I would like to address towards Meaghan for her presentation. So the first one that came in is there's a question around natural pollination in the far north. Did you have to bring bees in to artificially pollinate the crops? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, you got me. It was quite a lot of bees coming into the community garden, big and small, and the garden is also surrounded by a nearby meadow, so there was lots of flowers there, and we also there were some years where we would grow buckwheat as well, and or there's certain crops that attracted the bees, so we found that that was okay. But saying this, my coordinator had told me that this past year he found that there was a lot of wasps there, which I found was interesting, and not as many bees. So we'll see what happens.
And sort of on that same topic, were people unfamiliar with some of the vegetables that were being grown there, like bok choy? Was there a learning curve with some of these, the introduction of some new vegetable?
Yes, in the early years of the project, that was kind of a bit of a learning curve, but at the same time, there was an expansion of a food market that was locally run that occurs around 2 times a month. It's expanded since then, and I think that helped bring awareness to other like fresh local foods or fresh foods in general, and also with the Peterborough Health Services programs. For bok choy, for instance, we had kale because kale grew well, but there was only a small group of people that liked it in their smoothies. And so bok choy seemed to be a bit more tamer green to have. But yeah, with the new crops that we try, there's not a lot of room dedicated to them. It's to see if they grow, see how residents like them or their opinions of them, and then we go from there.
Great, thank you. A question for Paul on access funds for food security and transfer of traditional knowledge. Where did you get your funding for this project? And a similar question came in for Meaghan. So perhaps I'll start with Paul and then ask Meaghan the same one.
Yeah, thanks very much. So we have had, we've had a lot of support for this program, starting with the NWT on the Land Collaborative Fund that got us running with a pilot project. We've had funding just like Meaghan's program through the Climate Change Health Adaptation Program. And then recently, and I would encourage any folks representing Indigenous communities here, the Indigenous Community Support Fund is, I know it's all across the north. I'm not sure if it's national, but I'm assuming that it is. And there's money available for communities specifically around COVID-19 adaptation, but that includes food security. So I can forward a bunch of links if you're able to share them later.
You can post those even in the chat box if you have any
perfect.
of them.
Okay.
And Meaghan?
Similar to what the funds that Paul described, our main funding was the CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research. And then we had climate change and health adaptation program, and that one's good for applications coming from the community.
Okay, thank you. Meaghan, there was a question about the composter drums. The question is, are they readily available in major centers?
No, they're manufactured by Actium Resources, and it's located in Seaforth. However, the owner of the company has sent these compost drums to many places in the world, like in the tropical, to Fort Albany, and to British Columbia, for instance. So it's contacting him and seeing what's available.
Great, thanks. Paul, this one came in for you. Is there any study into the degree to which climate change is undermining traditional knowledge? How some of the signals from the land may become less reliable with time, and how to adapt to uncertainty?
So I saw that question come in and I got a little bit scared. I'm not sure if I'm qualified to answer it. I don't know specifically of any studies that are happening. I would imagine that there would be. I would hope that there would be. I know just from speaking with elders in the community that is certainly a concern that's people are aware of, and yeah, it needs to be addressed. I feel unqualified to speak to it, but I really appreciate the question. It's a big question, big concern.
Meaghan, this is a question that I'm going to direct to you. Has the rate of food insecurity in Fort Albany declined with the development of community gardens over time?
I cannot answer that one without a proper survey, and especially with COVID-19 going on as well. Also keep in mind that this garden is not providing all the fresh foods for the community. It's right now we're at the point of adapting to climate change and building like social and physical capacity. So for instance, this past season, 110 kilograms of vegetables were produced.
On the question about supplying the garden, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about supplies being brought into the community for gardening projects. Has that been impacted or will be impacted at all by the supply shortages that are happening, that we're all seeing across Canada?
For Fort Albany, in a sense, we were lucky as we've already built up our supply capacity. So now when I bring up supplies, it's fairly minor compared to before. So we did see a lumber increase, and that affected other projects, but not the garden project. But that was also same with my Bukak First Nation. We had bought the lumber the previous years, and so we didn't have to worry about the cost. But if another community was to start and chose to use untreated lumber that was bought, that would be an issue. Other than we've had some supplies issues, but we got really lucky on the most part. Sorry, I'm trying to think of, yeah, I was just trying to order early. There's just a bit more stress of making sure you have everything months beforehand, before the growing season.
So this is a question that I'll direct to each of you. Have you seen an increase in interest in food security projects during the pandemic? and among community members. So maybe Paul, I'll start with you with that question.
So yeah, the answer is yes. There's been a big demand. People are excited both from a cultural perspective and being able to eat a more traditional diet, but also just from an actual sort of calories input perspective. There's definitely been sentiment in the communities that, that people are really appreciating the food volume, even though we're not, measuring success that way. It is a major benefit of this program, is that people are experiencing increasing costs of store-bought food, and yeah, they are asking, talking to community government offices, and trying to get on lists of distribution within the community. So there's definitely a need. Yeah.
Meaghan? Sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Have you seen an increase in interest in food security projects during the pandemic among community members?
Yes. So at the beginning of our research projects, when it was coming into the community, people were like, I don't know about this subarctic gardening, but then with more awareness of climate change, there was more interest in it. And then with COVID-19, with the increase of costs and limited supplies, the main thing I go by with increased interest is that more people were requesting to borrow the tillers for their bush gardens. So I go with that for an increased interest.
Okay, and Meaghan, I'm going to ask you a question. Several came in about seeds that I want to ask you. I just have to scroll back up to the questions here. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to ask the first of 3, but they're all tied into seeds. So have people tried starting seeds indoors to help extend the growing season in the gardens that you're working with? And have they tried growing the Three Sisters garden, the squash, beans, and corn? And is there any efforts into going into seed saving?
So yes, people have started growing indoors. It's more people with a little bit more experience of gardening or a bit of the risk takers, but they would start pepper plants, for instance, and tomatoes, and then they would have them in pots once they're more mature and can be outside. And if there's a cold evening, they bring them inside to be protected from the cold. So yeah, there's some seed starters. As well with seed saving, I would like to, that's in our future plans. We've just started to work with training on collecting seeds because that would help create seeds that are more suitable for the region. And what was the third?
Seed saving.
Oh, sorry, the second one?
The corns, beans, and squash, the Three Sisters,
the Three
sorry.
Sisters. So we grow beans, we grow squash, we've done intercropping practices. Corn, we've tried, but it's it grows about this tall right now. So we could probably give it another go. We tried that a few years ago, but it would be very nice to do the Three Sisters. In Mabukek First Nation, we are doing the Three Sisters this upcoming year, and they have an outdoor classroom, and we're going to have plots with that.
Okay, and in the communities that you work with, were any of them already doing any traditional gardening?
Mabukek, there's people that have done some traditional gardening. In Fort Albany, I did see a question relating, is there crops with of more traditional plants? So we do have currants, we have raspberries, strawberries, mint is a popular one with the coordinator. I would like to bring in some sage, but it also has to we have to have the right growing conditions for some of these medicines as well. But we would like to bring in more. And then with the Meaghan First Nation, we have sweetgrass growing and sage and different berries as well.
Paul, can I ask the same question of you? Just to know in Tlicho territory, what's happening related to traditional gardening or any of that sort of gardening processes, you know, are they happening or that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in one of the Tlicho communities, Métis, which is the northwesternmost community, there's been a big push. There's actually quite a well-established garden there. They grow significant amounts of potatoes. They have even been raising some livestock, some pigs and chickens, and doing some laying hens as well. And there's talk about right now. There's negotiations with community governments to set aside sort of swaths of land that would be appropriate to turn into community gardens. So yeah, I guess right now just the one community of Métis is really championing local community gardening, and they have quite an amazing setup with high tunnel greenhouses and yeah. There was even talk of like trying to cultivate rice on the lake shore. It's anyway, it's very interesting. But that's the only of the 4 Tlicho communities. That's the one that's sort of most advanced with gardening.
Okay, thanks. And on the topic of greenhouses, Meaghan, would it be helpful to utilize greenhouse structures to extend the season and introduce the community to possibilities of increasing crop variety and harvest?
So right now we have high tunnels, which are seasonal greenhouses. We also have a greenhouse at the school, a small one. Other than that, I am hesitant to do greenhouses from like as myself, because that's a whole other degree, and you need to have the certain specs to have a like if you're thinking of like a year-round greenhouse. I don't have that knowledge on hand. I'm more of an ambient agriculture specialist. And also there's other potential issues, or not necessarily issues, but considerations for year-round greenhouses as well, like the inputs and the maintenance for that.
Okay, that sort of answers the question that just came in about the possibility of year-round greenhouses in the far north. So do you have any other comments about that?
That's not my specialty. It would be great if somebody with a specialty came in and they know because we're on the Mushkegowuk lowlands, so there's like you have to consider like the freeze and thaw, and yeah, that's not my specialty.
Thanks. Paul, do you know if there are any other research projects being done that are looking at the relationship between Indigenous youth, culture, and mental health?
Yeah, I was actually just digging through my files here. I know that there's research around like cultural resilience and identity and how that relates to mental health as well as physical health. Again, I know that research exists, and I have some links that I can post as well. I can put them in the chat.
One question about the program that you're actually doing, Paul, is how is language incorporated into this project? Like you talk about the youth being brought in to have tea with their elders when they bring fish to them or food products to them. Mm-hmm. Are they, and part of that is about cultural resilience. Are you seeing that as one of the success stories that's coming out of this, is the encouragement of teaching of Indigenous languages through that program?
Yeah, so we don't have a formal language component, but it certainly is happening organically as people just get together and spend time together. There's often, if harvesters come with the youth to join the elders, then there's often some translation that happens, and people picking up place names and even sort of anatomy of the fish and other animals that are brought in. Berries and traditional medicine as well is included in that. So yeah, the language learning is happening. It's happening organically, and we aren't really measuring it, but I just anecdotally can tell you that those kinds of things are happening. Yeah.
Great. I just have to keep flipping through questions and making sure I'm not asking the same ones over and over again. But I just want to follow up with something that Lee Lytle has posted about the Mattawa Eco Farm has done well using eco domes to extend the growing season. So just to put that out there, that
I've heard and I've talked with the group too.
Great. Okay, so have there been any connections with federal government, National School Food Program? If either of you know, how has this funding been allocated for culturally appropriately for Indigenous and First Nations community school food programs? So maybe Paul, I'll ask you that. So you were talking about the distribution of the foods. Has any of that been incorporated into school food programming?
So it hasn't been incorporated into, like, I don't know what the National School Food Program is specifically, but I know in the communities, one thing that's happening is that harvesters are bringing in their food and then working with school groups. Again, it's around teaching, sort of cutting fish and making dry fish, running these workshops using food that's been harvested through ts'eedı dung ts'eedy. But in terms of distributing the food to children through the schools and families through the schools, other than those cultural skills workshops in the classrooms, I'm not sure. But now I want to look into that program.
And I know, Meaghan, you did talk about having workshops with students in your presentation. Does any of the food that is harvested get brought into the school system at all for food programs?
During the school event, they do harvest it and they take it home. We do have seed planting workshops working with the school. Also, the greenhouse that is related, that's right beside the school as well. I'm thinking of what else. We have a light system so so students can watch plants grow, and we put in an aero garden system, a small one, at the nutrition class. And we're also working on lesson plans that relate to gardening and composting that fits the region.
Okay, thank you. And we just had two other comments come in about other growing units. So the Anishinaabe Nation have had some of our communities purchase grocer units, and they're working well for year-round production. So that just also answers that as well. The Green Igloo is another company that can be looked at for growing in the north.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for those comments. Meaghan, are there traditional food preservation methods being used to store food from the garden for the winter season, or have new techniques been taught, such as drying, canning, that will prolong the shelf life of vegetables? And I would also direct this to Paul with the meat that is being stored. So I'll start with you, Meaghan.
When it comes to vegetables, what we grow is usually eaten before it's stored. I think there's been a couple that have stored potatoes over the season in turnips. We in my Bukak First Nation, we just fit in. This isn't traditional, well, per se, but it's a freeze dryer to help store foods and be dehydrated. And also in that was inspired by Fort Albany, as people were dehydrating their vegetables either from the garden or from the food market, and so they could take them to camp, since the rivers are becoming more shallow and they have to consider what they're packing to go to camp.
And for our program, definitely drying fish and drying meat is a traditional skill that's heavily used in the communities. And so through the program, people are cutting the fish, making dry fish, smoking them, preserving the meat and fish in various ways as well to make it last as long as possible.
Thank you. Do either of you have any recommendations or suggestions for establishing similar programs in urban settings, especially in the context of limited space or no treaties?
Good question. I guess with gardening, if there's limited space, like if you can find a space that can have community gardens, there's many cities with community gardens, but other than that, it would maybe create a group where you have at-home gardens, but you guys work together on finding crops out, doing crops and tips and trial and error. But that's a very good question.
Yeah, I agree. It's a good question and a tough question. I think in terms of cultural learning programs, certainly if you can, like, who are the champions in your community? Who are the elders that have that knowledge to share, and what are the skills that they want to pass on? And then it's a matter of finding the space and raising some funds. When it comes to, like, for what we're doing with it's like harvesting based or wild food harvesting based. I don't have a great answer for an urban setting, but I like what Meaghan is talking about too in terms of sort of urban gardening opportunities, even backyard gardenings. I know, like, when I lived in Yellowknife, people were donating their backyards to others who might have interest in gardening as well. So you might be able to find some people to donate some land.
Thank you. Meaghan, has a Fort Albany First Nation engaged in partnerships or collaboration with other First Nations communities in Canada? For example, Six Nations in Ontario has an extensive seed collection and traditional knowledge about farming. How are you spreading the word and collaborating with other First Nations?
So with NAN, I'm currently working on lesson plans. The other would be the at-home gardeners or bush gardeners. They would connect to these other First Nation groups and communities and receive the information, and then I often share with me later, because I personally do not live in Fort Albany, and so I come up and do the specific project, and then I hear from the community members suggestions.
I'm still scrolling through more questions, sorry. There's also a comment came in from Haley Frederick about northern greenhouses. You know, Pasquiac Cree Nation in Manitoba has a smart farm which runs on LED light. In shipping containers can easily modify size to limit input costs. They are housed inside other buildings. I believe the First Nation holds the technology rights for Canada and are great to work with if wanting to explore as an option.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, are there any plans to do testing on traditional food sources to identify regarding degradation of the environment? So water contamination of fish or wasting disease of deer, any infectious diseases or illnesses that might be associated with meat. So how about I ask Paul that question?
Sure, yeah. So in the Tlicho region, there are programs for fish sampling, sediment sampling, water sampling in and around the communities, but then also fish sampling in more remote locations. That also has to do with mineral development that is happening in the region. So it's sort of monitoring potential contaminants that are known to be there from industrial practices. But certainly, yeah, climate change is I feel confident saying that it's also contributing to increased contamination. So yes, it's happening not directly through this program that I'm speaking about, but it's definitely a concern that's being looked at up north.
Meaghan, did you have any comments on that at all?
Our research group has also tested fish and wildlife for contaminants as well. That is a major component to our garden program when we test for soil, is to make sure that there's no contaminants, and we look for heavy metals, PCBs, and other pesticides that aren't great for human health.
Okay, thanks. There's a question that came in for both of you. At the beginning of the projects, how did you recruit participants or generate interest in them?
So if I can just jump in, ts'eedı ts'eedı had originally this idea that the program would target young people who were out of school and unemployed. And so we were looking originally at a very specific demographic. We even actually approached community justice coordinators to see if we could work with people who had community service hours that needed to be sort of court-ordered community service hours, because this program is providing such a great service to the community. And those efforts, there is a population that we targeted and were pretty unsuccessful at bringing in. There was no funding for stipends. Like the young people that we're working with are volunteering their time, and because the cost of living is so high in the north, there was sort of a recognition that we needed to recognize people's time and their contribution above and beyond the skills that they were learning. And so we've had to look for other funding or funding it through the ts'eedı government ourselves, to provide us, just a very small stipend to participants. But we've also worked with high schools, and then even social media postings and posters throughout the community. And all of a sudden, then when the program starts, then word of mouth is a big way to spread interest in the programs. But I was interested in how, it was an eye-opening experience, I guess, and a good piece of learning that people's time needs to be respected, even though we're giving people skills. These young people are learning, which is great, but it's expensive to live in the north, and everyone's time is valuable as well.
Meaghan, did you want to comment on that?
I agree with Paul's last comments. Like, yes, respect people's time and the cost of living in the north. This question is about how there's participation in the program. Just double checking. Our research group, we work with the band, and they bring in interest that they want to see for their community. And the gardening, at the time, the chief was interested in subarctic gardening, so that's when we came in. And I think during the production trials, we had to collect actual data. It wasn't as inviting as it could be for communities, which later on when I took over, that was a bigger focus for me. But the gardens were there and available, and there was programs with that. And I think it was just very important that people that were having their time and being employed in our group, that I took the time and learned more about Cree culture as well, and seeing how it goes both ways. So I learned as well. Actually, that was and so then that, I think that helped with having the knowledge, and that having this program where it focused on strategies that utilized techniques that already existed in the community and connected to gardening helped. And yeah, it was the beginning. There wasn't as many people that interested, or they wanted a summer job and they received training and then they seemed to like it and continued. And now it's expanded more, and and I guess in respect with COVID-19, since I wasn't able to go up there, our coordinator, there was a bit of a learning curve that, like, I used to go up there for over a month to help with the preps, and then I couldn't. And so he had to ensure to do the training and the gardening as well. And I think overall that ended up being a good thing.
So Paul, I see that you're answering one of the questions. I'm going to ask it so that everybody can hear the answer. Are there plans to record the teachings of the elders to the youth? Oh, it's now moved up. Hang on. I think it got moved into our answered section. Let me see.
Sorry, I've made your life more difficult.
Do you remember the question? It's disappeared from my screen now.
Yeah, it was around, are there any plans to record elders teaching these skills, so that there's sort of a record as young people become elders themselves? And so the answer is yes. I just posted a link there in the reply to funding through the Museum Assistance Program through Heritage Canada. And we've used that funding, the Tlicho have used that funding in the past to work with elders and record information that they felt was important, almost like how-to videos, particularly around skills and crafts that aren't done much anymore. And so there's a Tlicho Vimeo page that has about 6 different videos of people making fish caches and sewing bullet bags and making axe handles and things like that. So, I mean, yeah, most people have a cell phone. I think it's a great idea to record as much of this stuff as possible. And then, yeah, so that's the one funding that we've accessed through. So, and then it became a separate project altogether, but there's no reason they couldn't tie in with each other.
Okay, so I think I have sent a direct message to Meaghan regarding one question about funding. I'll have you answer that separately, because it's about asking about specific funding about workshops. So I'll have that sent to you by email. Okay, Meaghan? So I'm going to ask just one last question of each of you before we draw the webinar to an end. I just want to say how you can always tell the success of a webinar by the questions that keep coming in. So I might have to ask a few more than just one each. Just going back up to the caribou herds, have they been affected at all by forestry practices that you're aware of?
So forest fires, definitely. In the Tlicho region, as we speak, I'm not aware of commercial logging or commercial forestry practices. But there's roads cutting across to access various mining operations, and these are creating sort of funnels for caribou, and then wolves are picking up on the migrations of the caribou, and so there's been some concerns around wolf predation that's beyond normal because caribou are being funneled into certain corridors due to industrial development. But I don't, I don't know, in the Tlicho region, I don't know of any commercial forestry practices, so I can't speak to that directly.
Okay, and a similar one came in for you, Meaghan, regarding any disruption to the original lands and resources that have impacted the gardening projects that you're working on.
Sorry. Oh no, I'm not muted. Sorry, can you, is there a way of rephrasing it? Question.
I did ask for some clarification. It's from Yvonne Pompana, and she was wondering if there were any disruption to the gardening project or gardening generally, I suppose, happening where there is disruption to the land and resources through colonial influences. So let's say I'm thinking possibly mining or these such things. Yvonne, if you want to clarify a little bit more, that'd be helpful. But I'll just ask Meaghan if she has some comments.
I do have some comments. So interestingly, the garden space where the site was selected by the band had historically been cultivated when the missions were there. And so that space was, it used to be forest and it was cleared. And there used to be, or I guess there still is, drainage ditches along the rows, and those willow trees are what grew over the 40 years, grew naturally up. And that is why we have that space the way it is. And it's using an existing space that was disrupted by colonialism and making it into a space that's for the First Nation community.
Have you noticed, Meaghan, in terms of disruptions that climate change or increasing temperatures are affecting the success of the gardens? Or do you expect that'll influence them in the near future?
With increased temperatures, I suppose like some of the cooler crops, they are more prone to bolting. Also, the people who work in the garden, we have to consider the extreme temperatures. I went through my data to see like how warm did it actually get. And I remember there was days I was there and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's way too hot here. And our max recording was 39 degrees Celsius. And so when it's too hot, we, not 39, it's like less than 39 degrees Celsius, but when it's too hot, like we don't do work during that time because it's not safe for people.
Okay, and I think the last question I'll just ask you, Meaghan, is have rain barrels or geothermal ever been explored for gardening?
We have rain barrels. We also have rain barrels. We have large totes that we pump water from the lake into, and it's there when there isn't enough rainfall and there's a dry spell. Also in Mabukek First Nation, they have a gravity-fed irrigation system, which is pretty neat. That it connects to a creek that's uphill and it runs down to the site and collects into barrels.
Okay, thanks. And I'm going to ask the last question to Paul before I pull up our final slides. And you will see there's some information in the Q&A that you might be interested in just having a peek through. I'll get Stefan to maybe copy and paste some of that information into an email that we can send off to you too. Okay, so Paul, has the NWT local food strategy benefited your work in any way? Have you considered linking youth with virtual trades programs and nearby locals to developing trade skills apprenticeship programs? This could be used to develop the human infrastructure in the community that is needed to develop culturally respectable food innovation and infrastructure.
So yes, great question. The NWT local food strategy, I haven't connected with them at all. So I guess the answer is no. They haven't benefited our work, and we, I guess, haven't benefited their work either. But again, we're all learning here, so I'm going to reach out to them as well. The idea of trades development and skills development, looking at traditional economies like hunting and trapping, and even then value added like tanning and sewing and that kind of thing, I think has a ton of value. And that's a really good point around trying to champion that and looking at just recognizing traditional skills and their economic value, even above and beyond the cultural significance. Yeah, so thanks for that.
And do you two have any final words for one another before I switch to our final slides?
We got to stop meeting like this. The last pre-COVID trip, Meaghan and I were presenting, I think it was at ArcticNet in Vancouver. And yeah, I was inspired then as I am now. So it's great to see you again.
Well, I'm glad to see you again, Paul, and being a part of this presentation. We should meet up again.
I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to share the really important work that is happening on the ground in community, by communities, and really working towards food sovereignty within Indigenous communities, especially as we are confronted with the changing climate. So just want to commend you on the work that you're doing and that the communities that you work with are doing as well. So thank you so much for participating in the webinar. And as I sign off here, what I'm going to do is share a final screen of suggested resources that folks may be interested in. Final word about some of the work that the National Collaborating Center has been doing is related to a national assessment on the health of Canadians in a changing climate, advancing our knowledge for action. The Collaborating Center has done the first ever chapter related to a national assessment of this sort, which is titled Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples' Health in Canada. These you can find on the website, our website, NCCIH, as well as several other resources such as the nutritional health of First Nations and Métis in the Northwest Territories, a view to current and knowledge gaps. And if you go to the next slide. Finally, the National Collaborating Center is currently doing a number of podcasts related to climate change. The first has been uploaded onto our website, which is Drawing on Teachings from the Land to Adapt to Climate Change, with speaker Spencer Greening from the Gitga'at First Nation in Northern British Columbia. We will also be having a webinar on March 10th related to climate change and Indigenous peoples' perspectives on water and how it's being protected and adaptation strategies to protect it. So that is coming up on March 10th. So I'll just go to the final slide, Donna. If you are interested in joining our mailing list, here's the information to do so. So thank you again very much for our speakers. It has been a real pleasure to hear from you and the work that you're doing, and I look forward to collaborating in the future. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody for joining the webinar today. Bye.